Thank you.
Mr. Tully, before we move on, before we broke, you were telling us about the incident which led to you having some time off. Can we just put up on screen, please, if possible, BBC 000058. Grateful to Mr. Armstrong for this reference. BBC 000058. Chair, it's section A3 in your bundle.
Thank you.
And then if we go to page 13, and you see on the left page, reporting shift 20th of August 2016. I was rostered to D-Wing as a first responding officer for this shift. At approximately 8:30, so that's the morning, a first response was called to C-Wing, first floor. Upon arrival to the wing, what's that word?
Rushed, sir.
Rushed up the wing stairs. As I got to the first floor, I looked up and saw that
The feet.
saw the feet of a detainee from Ghana, ciphered for our purposes as D4940. He had tied a noose to the stair banister,
Yes, sir.
tied it round his neck, jumped on or off?
Off the stairs.
Off the stairs on the second landing. Detainees quickly supported his body weight and pulled him back over onto the landing, saving his life. The ligature was then cut from his neck with a fish knife. What's that next word? By an officer?
Yes, sir.
D4940 was unresponsive when the medical team arrived. Upon their arrival, the attending officers, I think,
Yes, sir.
were ordered to lock down the wing. When we tried to do so, the majority of detainees something and became aggressive. Refused and became aggressive and shouted abuse at officers. They felt aggrieved because they had possibly saved someone's life, but then were being locked up. The attempt to lock down the wing ended after about 10 minutes. What's the word before the label?
When, sir?
When D4940 became responsive and was taken to E-Wing's constant supervision room. After medical assessment, the doctor advised that he be taken to hospital because he couldn't speak and his breathing was restricted. An ambulance came to take him to East Surrey Hospital. I was chosen to be the
Handcuff officer.
Officer on the team of 3 DCO escorts accompanying him. And that's all I need to read. So that's just to cover off what you told us earlier. That's the incident, and we can date it by virtue of the note that you made. Right. Now back, please, to your witness statement at paragraph 119. Now, you were asked to turn your attention in the request for the witness statement, the inquiry made to you, about the oversight organisations, the Home Office, HMIP, the Inspectorate, and the IMB, and their presence at Brook House. First of all, the Home Office, where did they work?
They worked...
Home Office staff who were at Brook House?
Yes, sir. Home Office staff at Brook House worked in the second building, the main building in which detainees resided. Their offices weren't in an area which was accessible to detainees, but they worked in that building.
Right.
Second floor, I think.
Okay, would that be the top floor then?
Yes, sir.
And
although they did work in the visits corridor as well, I think occasionally they'd be required to give detainees updates on their case, although my insight into the workings of the visits corridor was limited because I rarely worked there.
Yeah. In terms of numbers, are you able to help with, on average, how many Home Office staff there would be at Brook House on any given day?
I'm not sure, sir. I'm sorry.
Weekends? Any idea?
No idea, sir.
Were they visible?
Barely.
And so far as you remember, in the 2.5 years you were there, did you have any interaction or involvement with any Home Office staff?
No, sir.
Can you name any of them?
No, sir.
Moving on to Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons, HMIP, during the course of your employment at Brook House, did you ever see any inspectors or any members of the inspectorate
Yes, sir.
within Brook House? And was that during an inspection?
I believe it was, sir, yes.
2016?
Probably, sir.
And did you talk to anybody who was there during the inspection?
I think I spoke to one inspector who visited me in the IT suite, which is where I was working on this particular day.
Yeah.
And he asked me about how accessible the computers were to detainees and what sort of websites they could access and how it worked. Besides that, I had little interaction with Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons, so.
While we're thinking about them, were they ever mentioned to you as an oversight body during the course of your training? I mean, did you know who they were when they pitched up, or had you heard of them before? Did you hear about them during the course of your employment? When was HMIP something you first became alive to?
We knew about the interesting thing is we knew about the unannounced inspection, which was strange because an unannounced inspection implies that the inspectors turn up unannounced and therefore would get an accurate reflection of what life inside the centre is like. But we knew it was coming, I think, in maybe the day before or a couple of days before. So I had heard of them before the inspection. I think I probably knew who they were.
Yeah.
When I was employed, it was probably likely that I was told about them in my training, although I don't remember being told about them.
Yeah. Did you think that the inspectorate was somebody to whom you could report concerns?
No, sir. Perhaps if I was asked about it, maybe.
I mean, while you were having this conversation, I think you said in the IT suite with this inspector or one of the members of the inspectorate who turned up for the inspection, we think in 2016, was it possible for you to have taken that person aside and said, look, I've got a few things to tell you? Did that enter your head?
Never entered my head, sir, no.
Because?
I was being asked specific questions about the IT suite. Never occurred to me, sir.
The IMB, now you say in your statement at paragraph 121, you saw members of the IMB operating at least every 2 weeks.
Yes, sir.
Yeah? Let me ask you, please, to look at documents that we've been asked to place before you.
Just on HMIP, sir, I didn't kind of know that they were a body I could go to raise concerns. I mean, as far as I was aware, they were just inspecting the sort of the conditions in Brook House in terms of what was available to detainees, what recreational facilities they could access. I didn't know there was sort of a sort of physical treatment of detainees was within their remit. I mean, I didn't know much about HMIP, to be honest. So it just didn't occur to me, sir.
I suppose if one was being critical, you could have found out.
Yes, sir.
In your own time or or even on company time, by going on a computer, but it didn't occur.
No, sir.
All right.
Mr. Ortman,
Yes.
excuse the interruption, but can I just ask a question that I think is probably related? Do you remember how you found out about the unannounced
Sorry,
inspection?
Bit of noise from
Yeah.
Mr. Goodman behind me.
I'm sorry. Can you remember how you found out about the unannounced inspection taking place? Was it amongst other staff?
Ramon knew. Our line manager, Ramon Giraldo, knew about it.
Okay.
So I imagine he was advised by one of his superiors.
So was it as part of a sort of formal briefing for staff, or was it more an informal comment that you were made aware
Just
of? Can you
told
remember?
in the activities office chair.
Okay, thank you.
And while the chair has asked that good question, which I should have asked, how long in advance of the so-called unannounced visit was Ramon telling you that the inspector is turning up?
A couple of days at the most, maybe a day.
Right.
So
And were you aware, one way or the other, of whether people were preparing themselves for the visit? In other words, making sure everything was in apple pie order.
well, I recall staffing was at an adequate level. We had a sports officer as well as a library officer and an activities officer. I believe, although I don't know for a fact, perhaps G4S can help you with this, that staffing on this occasion was adequate. So I believe that
Are you saying that, because it was a question I asked you yesterday about staffing, whether it was through, the problems with staffing you mentioned to us persisted throughout the whole period you worked, and
Yes, sir.
my recollection of your answer was it was.
yes, sir.
Are you saying that staff were specially brought in order to present a picture of Brook House which wasn't accurate for the visit?
That's what I'm suggesting, sir. Yes.
And was anything else done in order to present a picture of Brook House for the purposes of the inspection?
It's hard to remember, sir, but we were just focused on the activities department, making sure everything was in good condition, that
Yeah.
posters were up around sort of advertising that sports could be played on certain corridors and certain days, and made sure that all the computers were working, that there were enough bail applications and Section 4 applications printed off and were accessible in
Section
the
4
library.
application?
I struggle to remember actually what a Section 4 application is, but it's one of the applications which was available to detainees.
Yeah.
There was a whole range of applications which were available to detainees in the library, or should have been available. We made sure that enough were printed out, and books were in good order, and courtyards were in good condition, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So coming back, thank you, to the IMB, you said in your statement you saw members of the IMB operating at least every 2 weeks. I just want to show you something to which G4S would like attention drawn under a question that they've asked and which the Chair agrees with. Chair, it's at your bundle 108, so it's probably the last document, I think, in your bundles. And if we can put up on screen, please, the following document, IMB 000029. IMB 000029. And if we can just zoom into the top half. I'm not going to take very long over this, Mr. Tully, but you can see it's headed Date of Visits to Brook House, IRC, by board members of the Independent Monitoring Board for Brook House, 1st of April to the 31st of August. So it's in our period. And the point which is made from looking at this document is that, in fact, if assuming it's accurate and accurately represents the visits, the statutory visits that were made, more typically the IMB were there about twice weekly rather than every 2 weeks. Is it something that you will dispute?
It's not something I dispute, sir. No, it's just that I don't recall seeing them that regularly.
So, for example, if we look at the week commencing the 3rd of April, we can see there were 2 statutory visits on the Monday and Friday of that week. The next week, 10th of April, 3 statutory visits on the 11th, the 13th and the 15th. On the 17th apart from board meetings, there was one statutory visit on the 19th of April, and just by way of example, 24th of April, if we can scroll down please a little, we can see 2 statutory visits on the 26th and the 29th, and so on. I'm not going to go through the whole document, but it just simply reflects that perhaps your idea of the number of visits that were made, or at least statutory visits that were made by the IMB, may be wrong, either because you didn't see them, weren't aware that they were there, or have misremembered.
Yes, I mean, I was working an average of 4 days a week. Perhaps on some of the days that I wasn't in,
Yeah.
they arrived. I mean, may have been working in other parts of the detention centre when I was working on another unit on which they weren't. I mean, I saw them a couple of times every fortnight, a couple of times a week perhaps. But
Yeah.
I can't really remember sort of seeing them as regularly as suggested in this document, but I don't dispute that
No.
this is true.
Let me ask you the same question I've asked you about others. The IMB, whenever you did see them, did you have any interaction or involvement with them?
Very little, sir.
Did you ever have the chance, though, if you really wanted to whisper in their ear about your complaints about what was going on at Brook House? I mean, you could have done it.
Technically, yes, sir. I mean, but similarly with HMIP, it's, you know, when you're witnessing abuse in cells, which is where I bore witness to most abuse, there are no cameras in these cells.
Yeah.
So whose word is it going to be that is believed? Mine or that of the managers?
Yeah.
What would complaining to HMIP or the IMB actually achieve? I had no evidence of the abuse. I had no officers who were willing to sort of cooperate with me, either because I didn't know of any officers who would complain about abuse with me, or because the few officers I did have in mind were not present during instances of abuse. So it wasn't like I was going to say to the IMB or HMIP, I witnessed this manager mock and humiliate a detainee who was naked and suicidal in his cell and was covering himself in his feces, and then they were going to put that to the manager, and the manager was going to go, yeah, that was me. I mean, of course they weren't. So how was I going to prove any of this to the IMB or HMIP?
And while we think about the IMB, what was their reputation around the place? I mean, what did other officers think about the IMB?
They were seen as grasses, snitches. People didn't trust the IMB.
So if you had whispered in their ear, and if that had led to difficulty for others, and it had been discovered that you had complained to them, and it came back to you, what would your life have been like at Brook House?
Similar to that of other G4S staff that complained about mistreatment, marginalisation, bullying, intimidation.
Okay. Thank you. We'll take that down. Now, I want you to give us a little help, please, about the layout of Brook House. And we've got a plan, but it's fairly rudimentary and may not help over much. So I wonder if we can put back up those 2 images that we've seen several times already, INQ 000062 and 63. Because I just want to ask you some more questions just to sketch out the place for us, more than you have already. And 63. Thank you. Right, we've got those 2 images again. Now, you've told us about that building in the top left image, which stands alone. That's what was the term for that building?
In the top right, sir.
Yeah, that single building.
The visit centre.
So that's the visit centre.
Yes, sir.
Then we've got the capital H, which reflects the main building, or the second building as you refer to it from time to time. And although it's difficult to tell, the building right at the top, if we're looking at the left-hand image, that's the gatehouse building, which you've been talking about. That building is actually separated from the H-shaped building. In other words, there's that, what did you call it?
Sterile
That
area, sir.
sterile area. So one should imagine that if they're leaving that first building and going to the residential part of the detention centre, then you would have to cross that yard in order to get to one of possibly two doors or gates that go into that building.
Correct, sir.
Yeah. So it's not very well represented there. If we look on the image, at the image on the right, we might just about make out that gap where that red splodge is
Yes, sir.
on the wall of the first building.
Yes, sir.
So there's a gap and an outside area where you step from one building to the next.
Yes, sir.
Now, let's see if we can work our way around the building using either image. Let's just remind ourselves, E-wing is the green one.
Well, yes, sir. E-wing's at the bottom of the green one, but
So that's the ground floor.
the ground floor, yes.
What was above E-wing?
B-wing, sir.
So
Okay.
typically, the flooring or the number of floors in each wing or in the way the building is constructed, 3 floors?
Each wing, yes, usually.
Each wing has
yes.
3. But E-wing on the right occupies only the ground floor,
Yes, sir.
which includes the CSU that you told us about yesterday.
Yes.
Above the E-wing is B-wing, which was designed to be the induction unit. And how many floors does B-wing have?
2, a ground floor and a first floor. But
Yeah.
the ground floor is actually on the,
first
floor, and the first
yeah.
floor is on the second
Second
floor
floor.
because it's above E-wing.
So we should imagine that half of that part of the right-hand side of the H as we're looking at it, by which I mean if you dissected where you've got the centre part of the building that goes across, the quarter that we're looking at in the bottom right is ground floor, E-wing, and the upper 2 floors are B-wing,
Yes, sir.
which makes up the 3 floors of that quarter, if you like, of the H.
Yes, sir.
So far, so good?
Yes.
If we were to go up through E or B, as the case may be, what is the wing closest to the visitors' reception area?
That's A-wing, sir.
That's A. So that's red,
Yes, sir.
and that's A-wing. And that's got how many floors?
3, sir.
So that's got 3.
Yes, sir.
Moving to the other side, the left-hand part of the H, let's start at the part closest to us, the orange. Which wing is that?
D-wing, sir. Delta wing.
D.
D-wing.
And how many floors is Delta or D-wing?
3, sir.
So that's got 3, which leaves one part of that left-hand part of the H closest to the cars at the front. Colour blue,
Yes, sir.
and that's got to be C-wing.
Indeed. Sir.
Also 3 floors.
Yes, sir.
We'll come to some of the internal fixtures and fittings in a bit. But looking at the image on the left and a little of the image on the right, we can see the outside courtyards.
Yes, sir.
You pointed out yesterday the one next to D-wing with the awning above it,
Yes, sir.
close to where the library is,
Correct.
with some tables. Was that astroturfed out there?
Yeah, so or something similar. Yes.
Yeah. But we can see just on the perimeter that there is quite high fencing
Yes, sir.
and barbed wire or razor
Razor
wire,
wire, sir.
and the same for all of the courtyards.
Yes, sir.
And the one on the right, difficult to make out. Does it have, and don't let me put words in your mouth, but just the way I'm looking at it, has it got some form of sports surface?
Yes, sir. It was a basketball
Yeah.
court. but it looks like this picture has been taken after a detainee managed to evade removal by climbing the basketball hoop and sitting up there. So this was taken. It was taken away basically, but the markings of the basketball court remain there.
And although we can't see them very well, there are two other courtyards by the other wings. Do they have similar markings?
Yes, sir. The C wing courtyard had a.
So remind us, C wing is on which side?
The left, sir.
Left.
Where you can see a tiny shade of blue on the right hand image.
Yeah.
This had football markings and 2 football goals. It was like a gravel courtyard.
Yeah.
And the one on the opposite side, on the right, coming out of A wing, was another gravel courtyard on which detainees would play cricket.
Yeah. So those are the residential wings, and we'll come back to, as I say, some of the internal fixtures and fittings in a bit. We've got the bit that struts, that joins the two long H, parts of the left hand or the right hand part of the capital H. And what would just tell us in a couple of sentences, apart from the library in that building with the windows, what else is in those 3 stories?
Looking at the D wing courtyard.
Well, no. Yes. I mean, I just want to know generally the bit the strut bit that joins the two long arms of the H.
Uh-huh.
What generally is in that area?
So, if you looking at the left image, if you look at the courtyard on the right, bottom right, on the ground floor, you can see the 2 windows going outside to the courtyard.
Yeah.
That was an IT suite.
Mm.
Above that, on the second floor, there was another IT suite. Above that, on the 3rd floor, was a mosque and a multi-faith room.
Yeah.
Going over to the left-hand side of the building, where you have the sort of garden-like D-wing courtyard with chairs and fake grass, as we say, on the ground floor there's a library. Above that, on the 1st floor, there's an arts and crafts room and a classroom. And above that is a sort of church type room and a music room.
Yeah.
If you go sort of along the corridor into the centre of the very, very centre of the H, there you'll find the detainee shop, the gym, doors leading to the visits corridor, which go in the direction sort of away from the 2 courtyards that we can see well, so towards the perimeter road. And they lead to small meeting rooms and the visits hall.
Okay. And so finally, as far as the H shape, of course, it's not exactly an H shape, not least because there's that great big fat area in the middle that goes from back to front, as far as the image is concerned. What is in that part of the building closest to us, just to the right of the awning?
The kitchen, sir.
So
the kitchen and the staff room, sir.
Right. And how many staff rooms were there?
On the main unit, I remember there being 2 staff rooms.
On different floors?
Yes, one on the very top floor, on the 3rd floor, and one on the ground floor, next to the kitchen.
And the building or that part of the building, which is the other side of that joining area where the gym and the multi-faith rooms and so on are, which is closest to the first building?
Yes, sir.
What's that?
So the Home Office would have their offices on the 3rd floor, I believe, maybe the 2nd floor.
Yeah.
Well, the 2nd floor is the 3rd floor. You've got the ground, the 1st and 2nd. So on the 2nd floor is where I think you'd have the Home Office offices.
Yeah.
And offices for the senior management team would also be on this 2nd floor. Ben Saunders and Steve Skitt also had their offices on the 2nd floor.
Okay.
And HR, sir.
And HR. Now, you mentioned a little earlier radio announcements. Did they come from a control area? We don't need to know where that is, but did that come from a control area?
Radio announcements on the whole came from the control room,
Yeah.
unless they were regarding a visit for a detainee. That would be made from the visits corridor.
I see. And if you were a detained man, let's say on, forget E-wing for the moment, but if you were a detained man on A-wing, were you able to move freely from A-wing to another wing?
If you're a detained man, no,
Yeah.
sir.
So you were stuck on A-wing, come what may?
Well, during association periods, you could obviously leave, go to the courtyards, but you couldn't go to other wings, sir. No.
So if you were on A-wing, you were limited to the common parts of A-wing, and you were limited to the courtyard, which connected with A-wing, but that's as far as you could go. Unless, what if you were going to the gym, for example?
Yep, you could go to the gym, sir. You could go to D-wing courtyard. You could go to C-wing courtyard. The only place you couldn't go on any of the other wings, but you could go to any other area, any other association area, be it courtyards, the gym, the library, the IT room.
But the one thing you couldn't go is to the accommodation parts of the other wings.
Yes, sir.
Is that perhaps how we should see it?
Yes, sir.
All right. How did detained men move from wing to wing? I mean, did they have any passes when you were there?
So to gain access to your wing, you were meant to show a wing officer your pass, and then he would allow you onto the wing. If you tried to get access to a wing that you didn't reside on, then the officer should say, show me your pass. Detainee would show him his pass. It wouldn't have D-wing, C-wing, or whatever wing they were meant to be on it, so they would be denied access to the wing.
Right.
That was meant to happen.
When you say meant to happen, was it
Rarely-
in the breach?
Well, I mean, that often did happen, but it often didn't happen as well.
Yeah. So do we understand that there was at all times an officer manning the doors onto the accommodation parts for the wing to stop detained men whose wing it was not entering?
Well, given the lack of staff on the wing, that wasn't possible. So staff would have to juggle all their other responsibilities with trying to man the door and make sure people weren't coming onto the wing who shouldn't be there.
So what happened? Are you saying that officers who were supposed to man the doors weren't manning the doors?
Well, the door would be locked, so they didn't have to physically have someone at the door at all times.
Right.
But obviously detainees would want to leave their wing to access the recreational areas, so either they were left waiting to leave, or someone would have to man the door, but you couldn't have someone manning the door at all times because of all the other responsibilities. So often there was kind of large queues that would form from detainees trying to leave the wing or come back onto the wing.
And did that cause frustration?
Yes, it did, sir.
In what way? How did it manifest itself?
Or detainees would become very upset, and it would be a real source of tension between wing officers and detainees. I mean, staff were trying to juggle all the other responsibilities that they had, but obviously detainees didn't care for that. They wanted to get to the library or the IT room to work on their cases.
Yeah.
Or go to the gym, or go to the courtyards.
And the passes they had, were they photo passes, or did it simply indicate which wing they were on?
They were laminated passes with a picture of a picture the size of like a driving license photo with their face on it.
Yeah.
It would be colour coordinated, so detainees on B wing would have a green card, detainees on Delta wing would have a orange card, detainees on C wing would have a blue card, detainees on A wing would have a red card. That was to make it a little bit easier for staff to sort of ascertain which detainees should be where. The cards would have a small barcode on it, which detainees could use to buy things from the shops. I think it would have their date of birth as well and their reference number, maybe some other information also.
All right.
And their cell number.
And tell me this, if you were inside each of the wings, Were the wings colour-coded internally, according to the colour on the outside?
I think they were, sir. Yes, I think so.
Presumably, you couldn't just walk off E-wing
No, sir.
if you
no,
were
no,
on
no.
E-wing, so
You-
that was an exception to the...
You could never come on and off E-wing
No.
unless you were being taken to the gym while the rest of the centre was locked down.
Yeah.
So,
Now, tell us about the reception area. Now, just remind us, the reception area, looking at the image, is where?
on the ground floor of that bulky bit in the centre of the H,
Yeah.
towards the perimeter road, so towards
Right.
the first building.
And tell us about what would happen. You're a detained man. You've been come off a van for the first time, and you're entering Brook House, or you might be entering Brook House for a second or third time, having been moved and transferred back. What happens to you when you enter detention reception?
So I didn't work at detainee reception, so my knowledge of how it works in practice is quite limited. But you would wait in a waiting room, because often a number of detainees would show up would be escorted to Brook House at any one time, and you would be asked a number of questions. There was lots of paperwork that had to be handed over. So the admission of a single detainee took quite a while.
Yeah.
So it was a long and lengthy process for detainee reception staff. It was never a job I had to do, so I'm not quite sure
Yeah.
exactly what was involved.
All right. I'm sure somebody else will help us with those issues. The wings you call A, B, C, D, and E, but I think we'll also find that they went by different names.
Yes, sir.
You called D wing at one point Delta,
Yes, sir.
and so they were also called Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta,
Yes.
and Echo.
And I think Dove, Clyde,
Yeah, I was going to ask Aaron.
Aaron, yes.
Aaron, Beck,
Yes, sir, that's familiar.
Dove, Clyde, and Eden.
Eden, that's it. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And I think if you go round the centre, and we may see on some of the images, you'll see those names above doors.
Yes, I think
and on
that was
wings.
actually the preferred, because you had your kind of, because as an officer you were either sort of, your radio was either sort of Delta 1 or Delta 2, so to avoid confusion between when references were being made to wings or officers, it wouldn't be referred to as Delta Wing, I imagine, because that might confuse someone on the radio that you might be speaking to Delta 1 or Delta 2 over the radio, so perhaps that's why they were given
Names.
different names, yeah.
But typically, what did staff refer to the wings as?
A, B, C, D and E wing.
Yeah. Now, I'm looking at your paragraph 133 of your inquiry statement. Each of the wings, so A, C and D, had 3 floors to them. We'll see from time to time in the footage a stairwell, and so they're all fairly similar. B was different because it only had 2 floors, but I think it had a stairwell nonetheless, and they all have rooms or cells off them, and in the common parts, which I think was on the ground floor of each of those wings, you would have pool tables, table tennis, tables to sit at, that sort of thing. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And would they all have netting
Yes, sir.
on
Apart from
each of the
E-wing.
landings, or just the top landing?
Each of the landings, sir.
And the netting was anti-suicide netting.
Yes,
is
sir.
The idea.
And they called it netting, but it wasn't. It was wire. It was made of wire.
So, but wire netting, if you like, I suppose.
Yes, sir. I guess
But not rope netting or anything
No.
like that.
not a soft landing for anyone that
No.
tried to harm themselves.
Yeah. And how many rooms were there on each floor of each wing?
Roughly 20 or 19, sir.
And were they, apart, forget E-wing for the moment, which was different, but were they double occupancy at least until about May 2017?
Yes, sir, they were.
And they ran either side of the wing?
Yes, sir.
And describe to us, please, the rooms, or the cells as you've called them. What were they like inside?
The cells were small. They had one unopenable window. There was a toilet in the cell, which was partially concealed by a wall, like a wall that went sort of 90 degrees around it. But it
It's
had
like a wave shape. that you
yeah.
also
So
remember?
there was a toilet in the corner of the cell,
Yeah.
but then it had a sort of wall around it. But then there was about a 30-degree gap through which the detainee could pass through to use the toilets. But if you walked into this, so if you walk into the cell, the toilet there was a sink immediately to your right, and then behind and the sink was coming off a wall. Behind that wall was the toilet, and so if you were, but as I say, there was a sort of 30-degree gap in the wall, maybe bigger. Haven't done the measurements, but there was a gap big enough for someone to walk through to go to the toilet. The bed on the left, if you just walked into the cell, if you were lying or sat on that bed, you would be able to see clearly.
Just pause there. So we get our lefts and rights, because I don't know, but I suspect some of the rooms or cells had the toilet on the right and perhaps some on the left, or were they all identical? Or is that too difficult a question after all this time?
Yeah, can't say with complete certainty.
May
sir.
not matter, but
I think
let's
they're always
imagine.
on the right, to be honest.
All right, well, let's imagine they're always on the right, and you're walking into the cell. All right, I'm at the back where the unopenable window is.
Yes.
You're walking in, you're at the door.
Yes.
And we can have this in mind when we see footage from time to time. Toilet on your right.
Immediately to your right, in the
Immediately
corner.
to your right. Bed here.
Yes.
So left and right.
In the left end and right end corner of the room.
Yeah. So if you're in the bed here, are you saying you can see into the toilet?
Perhaps not if you've got your head on the pillow, but
Yeah.
if you're sat on the bed or you're lying, at the right enough angle, you should be able to see the toilet.
And what was done to preserve privacy?
There was a bit of Velcro which was stuck.
When you say a bit of Velcro, do you mean a curtain of some description?
Well, so on the walls, on that wall that the sort of toilet was partially concealed by, there was on the outside of the wall there was a bit of Velcro on one bit of the gap and a bit of
lengthways, up and down.
a bit of Velcro.
Vertically.
Yes, sir. A bit of Velcro on one side of the gap in the wall and a bit of Velcro on the other side of the gap in the wall.
Yeah.
Detainees would be given a bit of cloth to attach to either side to the Velcro on either side, so that his roommate couldn't see him defecating or urinating.
Did that avoid smell?
No, of course not, sir. No.
Or noise?
No, sir.
No. And when you say the detained men were given the cloth, did they have to mount it themselves?
Yes, sir.
And did that happen during your tenure? In other words, while you were working there, is this some addition that was made to the toilets in the cells so that there could be a modicum of privacy? Or was that there when you'd arrived?
I think it was there when I arrived, sir.
Right. Was it something detained men were happy about?
No, sir.
Because
The room smelt of faeces, because there was a toilet in the cell, and because it's sometimes the Velcro wouldn't stick, sometimes the Velcro had kind of wasn't applied to the wall properly. You're in a room with a stranger, you can hear him and smell him defecating at times, you can see him. I mean, who wouldn't have complaints, sir?
there came a time in May 2017 when rooms became triple occupancy, was that all rooms or just some of the rooms?
Just rooms on the ground floor, sir, on, I think it was A, C and D wing.
Right, not B.
Not to my knowledge, sir.
So that meant what? 3 men to a room,
Yes, sir.
sharing exactly the same facilities as before, but
Indeed,
the problem
sir.
multiplied by 3, not by 2.
Yes, sir. The rooms weren't increased in size, or there was just a bed added to the room.
And when you say a bed added, presume a bunk bed.
Yes, sir.
So you had 2 men sleeping on one side, another man on the other. And do you remember offhand whether the bunk bed side, to accommodate now the 3rd man, was that on the side where you could view into the toilet, or was it on the blind side?
I think it was on the blind side, sir.
What other facilities were there in these rooms for the men?
There was a locker underneath each bed.
Yeah.
So Detention had their own locker, although, of course, when a 3rd bed was added to the ground floor cells, one of these lockers would have to be shared. There was a...
Under locker, was there a key to it?
Yes,
or?
they were given their own sort of
So it was a
small
locker
key.
where what could lock away
Family
valuables?
photos that were
Yeah.
important to them, files that were of importance.
Yeah. What else did they have?
A kettle,
Yeah.
TV.
Yeah. Where was the TV?
The TV was sort of, if you went through the cell door, it was kind of just immediately up to your left on
So
a
it was
bracket.
bolted to the wall, and a sort of almost ceiling height.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Almost.
And freedom to watch whatever they wanted.
I'm not sure what channels were on there. I think Freeview channels were on there.
Yeah. Sky.
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
No. So no football.
No,
or
sir.
Sports channels, but what? Just basic terrestrial channels and Freeview channels.
Yes, sir. Things like, More 4, I think, was on there. And
Yeah. Any foreign language channels? Do you know?
maybe, sir. It's hard to remember. I think so, actually, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Now you say.
And presumably the 3 men to a room was even less popular than 2 men to a room.
Yes, sir.
Now, on the ground floor of each of the wings, taking into account that B wing was actually on the 1st floor, or the ground floor of B wing was on the 1st floor of that wing, just describe to us the common parts, if you like. What were the tables like? What facilities were there on the wing?
There were tables and chairs that were fixated to the ground in the centre of the ground floor on each wing. There was a pool table on each wing, and there was a table tennis table on each wing. The wings were kind of decorated with house plants and bits of artwork that detainees had done in the arts and crafts room. I've said in my statement that I don't really think, given that the building was built to the standard of a Category B prison, that there was much more G4S could have done to improve the sort of physical elements of the communal areas of the wings. Because, you know, what can you do?
Yeah.
I thought the artwork was a nice touch.
Yeah. Where did men shower?
They showered on the 1st floor, sir, on the wings.
So each of the wings had showers, communal showers.
Yes, sir.
And how private were they?
They were pretty private, sir.
Were
In that
they-
you could pull across a shower curtain and a door, so you wouldn't be
Yeah.
seen showering.
And if after the shower they dried themselves, did they have to go back to their rooms to dry themselves, or could they do that in the shower, the communal shower area?
They could turn off the shower, step out of the shower, but so that they were still behind a door,
Yeah.
and so they could dry themselves there if they wished, or they could walk back to their cells wet and dry themselves in their cells.
Yeah. Were there other lavatories on the wing? In other words, if you wanted to use the loo as a detained man, or indeed as a staff member, were there toilets other than those in the rooms?
Not on the wing, sir, no. In fact, there were no other toilets that detainees could use other than the ones in their cells, as far as I'm aware.
So what about staff members?
Well, staff could leave the wing and go to use staff toilets, sir.
So the men were limited to their own rooms.
Yes, sir.
Clothing. What did men wear? Unlike prison, was there prison clothing, or like prison, was there prison clothing, or were they allowed to wear their own clothes?
They're allowed to wear their own clothes, sir. If they came and they barely had any clothes, they were given sort of jumpers, but they weren't sort of the grey jumpers that you expect to see in HMPs.
Okay. Yeah.
They were just sort of blue or orange or whatever.
Okay. And if they wanted to wash their clothes, how did that happen?
They could use the laundry room, sir, which was on the second floor of each wing.
And that was a separate room, was it?
Yes, it was at the end of the wing. So you'd go to the wing office. You'd ask the wing officer if you could have some washing detergent, and then you'd take it up to the to the laundry room and put your laundry in.
And you'd be responsible for doing that yourself?
The detainees say yes.
Was there a dryer as well?
I think so, sir.
Otherwise, how would they dry their clothing?
Yes, exactly. I think there was.
Yeah. What about cleaning the wing and the rooms? Who was responsible for that?
The wings would be cleaned by detainees who were working for £1. You could apply for a job. You were paid £1 an hour. So the wings were cleaned by detainees. The rooms, I think, were cleaned by detainees when they became vacant.
Yeah.
But obviously when they were lived in, it wasn't, you couldn't have another detainee who was responsible for cleaning the wing going into the cells of other detainees.
Yeah.
So the rooms, as a consequence, would become quite dirty, even if the detainees living in them were themselves clean. They were sort of depending on the previous inmate having been sort of clean himself. And although the rooms were sort of cleaned when vacant, because people were living in them for quite long periods of time, they developed an unpleasant smell in most cells, even though if they sort of appeared clean on the surface.
Yeah. But if it got to intolerable levels, I mean, you could imagine in a two-man cell, one person who is very clean and tidy and organised, and another who is the exact opposite. Those of us who have children will recognise that description. But in its application to detained people, was that a source of conflict and tension?
Yes, sir.
And who would take responsibility for cleaning?
The detainees,
Between
sir.
them. What I mean is, you could imagine there would be arguments about whose turn it was, for example.
Yes, sir.
So, presumably, if you went on a wing now, you might find, if it was completely populated, you might find different levels of cleanliness in different rooms according to who's in them at any given time.
Precisely, sir.
Okay. But so that we understand it, no one else other than the detained men was responsible for cleaning the wing or the rooms.
I think Aramark staff who were responsible for they were responsible for catering, but also for cleaning. Aramark was the company. They would clean the wings at times, but not the cells.
Okay.
As far as I know.
Now, you told us that each room had a kettle. No point having a kettle if you don't have tea and coffee. Where did that come from?
You could get tea and coffee, I think, from
The shop?
at breakfast time.
Or from the shop or not from the shop?
Yes, you could. Yes.
You could buy all sorts of things in the shop, couldn't you?
Yes, you could. Yeah.
Including vegetables and all sorts of things
chocolate.
if you go there.
Flip flops.
Yeah, everything. It was a mini store,
Yes.
almost.
Yes, sir. But I think tea and coffee was actually free for detainees.
Okay, so you could pick that up off, the servery?
Yes, in the morning, I think, and
Yeah.
perhaps in the afternoon from the wing
Yeah.
office, if you were polite enough to the officers.
And if you go on the wing, you'll see a sort of shuttered long area. Is that the servery on each wing?
Yes, sir.
And is that where the men would get their breakfast, lunch and dinner?
Yes, sir.
And where would they eat it?
Either in their cells or on the. There were a few. There weren't many spaces on the ground floor. There was chairs and tables fixated to the ground, but there were fair few spaces. Not space for everyone, but
Yeah.
some detainees would sit there and eat.
And where would you get your cleaning products to clean? Where would you get your toilet rolls and other sanitary items?
The wing office, sir.
Right? And was it rationed, or could you just, 1 minute after the next say, I want a toilet roll, I'll have another one, please? I mean, what monitoring was there of supplies?
It was just within sort of reason. If someone asked for a toilet roll and 2 seconds later they asked for another one, they
Yeah.
probably wouldn't get one. But if they asked sort of the next day or a couple of days later, they would likely be given one.
Yeah.
You could buy better soap and stuff like that from the shop. There was
Yeah.
kind of just the bog standard bar of soap and
Yeah.
sort of shower gel that you were given in the wing office.
Yeah.
If you had the money in your account, you could buy sort of Nivea or Dove from the shop.
I see.
So if you had the money, you could have some nicer stuff.
Where did the money come from?
Family or relatives or loved ones would send it in for detainees, or they would turn up with cash, or if they worked
Yeah.
cleaning wings or in the kitchen or
Yeah.
in the library, then they would be paid £1 an hour.
Let's assume you didn't work. Let's assume you had no loved ones who were able to give you money, and let's assume that when you were detained, you had no cash on you. What
Which was
happened to
often the
men like
case,
them?
particularly for refugees who turned up on
Yeah.
a boat or in the back of a van.
So what happened to them? Were they given cash to buy things at the shop?
I think something like 90p or something was added to your account each day by the Home Office,
Yeah.
so they could accumulate some money. I'm not sure if the exact number could have been slightly more, could have been slightly less.
Yeah. In mentioning Aramark, there was something called a cultural kitchen, which I'm not sure we've mentioned so far.
Oh, yes.
Tell us about that. What was the cultural kitchen?
This was a kitchen. This was like a kitchen in the association areas. It was on the first floor, in the corridor running along the middle of the H.
Mm.
So on the same floor as the gym and the detainee shop. It was very near the detainee shop.
Yeah.
And detainees could apply to cook in the cultural kitchen. It was very popular because you could request certain ingredients, and the food at Brook House was so unpopular that was provided by Aramark to the detainees that detainees would really relish the opportunity to cook in the cultural kitchen because they were given quite a good range of ingredients. They'd often cook a lot of food and dish it out to the other nationalities, so because often, nationalities sort of stuck together. So if there were Indians cooking in the cultural kitchen, they'd make some food that would be, not what they were used to on the wings, dish it out to their friends.
Yeah.
Equally, Jamaican detainees did the same. You were only allowed to cook in the culture kitchen if you didn't have certain convictions. So if you had had a violent criminal record, then you wouldn't be allowed in there because you had access to knives.
Yeah.
But most detainees were given clearance to cook in the kitchen.
And this was a kitchen in which there were several ovens.
Yes, sir.
So several people could cook at the same time, and utensils and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say that the food wasn't popular, was it because it just wasn't good, or it wasn't what the men detained at Brook House were accustomed to?
I didn't eat the food, so I didn't want to. So
Did staff eat the food there? Was there a canteen for you?
Yeah, so there was a
Did you
canteen.
Did you get the same food as
Not the same food. We got the food for staff was cooked in the same kitchen as the detainees' food, but we got different food.
By which you mean, what was different about it?
Well, it was nicer food. It was just food that people would be willing to buy.
Yeah. You mean better quality, you felt?
Yes, sir.
But are
I mean,
you saying...
some wing officers did eat the food on the wings to
Yeah.
save money, but
Did you paid for it, did you?
not if you ate the food that the detainees ate. No.
Yeah. But if you...
But if you wanted to have better food,
Yeah.
you had to buy it from the servery that was in the staff room.
Yeah. Do you know, Mr. Tully, I mean, you said to us, I mean, the impression that we gained from you is that the staff, if they wanted to pay for it, had better quality food
Yes.
than the detained man, clearly, who didn't have to pay for it, although a staff member could pay for that food because it would be cheaper. But are you saying, from your perspective, that detained men were given poorer quality food deliberately as a cost-saving exercise? Is that what you're telling us?
It's hard to say, sir. I mean, whether it's because of cost saving, I don't know, but perhaps, I don't know, sir.
All right.
I mean, some detainees didn't mind the food, but a lot of them hated it. You know, they just thought it was bland and at times inedible. So, I mean, there were probably a few occasions when I did actually try the food, but it's not something I wanted to put in my body often. So,
No. I want to ask you about E-Wing now, coming away from the other wings. And Chair, I see the time. It's 3 o'clock, and to give the transcribers a break, now's as good a time as any. So if you are in agreement, shall we say 3:15, please?
Thank you very much.
Right. Mr. Tully, 135, paragraph, your statement, page 33. You probably don't need it to refresh your memory, but if you do, it's there. I want to ask you about E-Wing, please. How many cells on E-Wing?
Approximately 12.
Although you say you can't remember the exact number.
Yes, sir.
And were they the same as the cells you've been describing to us?
They were, sir, apart from cells 7 and 8.
Right. So we've got approximately, let's say, 12 rooms or cells on E-Wing. Were they double occupancy?
Technically, they could be, but there was only ever one
Person in each?
person in each, so they were single occupancy cells, but they were suitable for 2 people as far as
Yeah.
G for us was concerned.
Okay. You say with the exception of 7 a days.
Yes, sir.
What was exceptional about 7 a days?
They were the same size, much of the cell was the same, but they were constant supervision cells, so instead of having a small, narrow viewing panel through which you would observe the detainee, you had 2 large glass windows through which you could much more easily observe a detainee.
Yeah.
So they were that way so that officers could sit outside the cell and constantly observe a detainee who is at great risk of self-harm or suicide.
I think we see one such cell during some of the events on the 25th of April regarding D1527.
Yes, sir.
And so typically that would be a cell, or those would be cells, 7 and 8, used for constant supervision by a DCO with an ACDT form on his or her lap, making constant observations.
Yes, sir. Every couple of minutes,
Yeah,
maybe 5 minutes.
yeah. And what, you'd be sitting on a chair,
Yes, sir.
just watching.
Just watching.
And when you had finished your shift of constant supervision, somebody else would take over from you.
Yes, sir. You'd hand over the ACDT and they'd continue the observations.
And how long would the observation be for each individual? Was there a limit to it, or could it go on for hours, or what?
It would depend if it would go on for hours, could go on for days, if the detainee was...
Not what I mean, and it's probably my question. What I mean is, if you, Callum Tully, were assigned to constant supervision, would you be sitting there all day or just for a couple of hours?
Should be a couple of hours. Sometimes I wouldn't. I mean, to be on a constant supervision all day was rare without being relieved.
Yeah.
It should have been, a couple of hours, I'd say. And that was probably most often the case.
Yeah. Echo Wing, or as you also call it, but E-Wing, for ease of reference, that too had a pool table.
Yes, sir.
You remember a sofa in the centre of it.
Yes, sir.
And if you were on E-Wing, were you also able to leave the cell?
You're able to leave the cell, sir, yes, not the wing.
Yeah. Let's just understand this. Let's forget cells 7 and 8 for the time being. What other reason would bring you onto E-Wing other than self-harm, suicidal ideation, for which you would almost certainly go in 7 or 8 for constant supervision? Forget those 2 cells. What kind of detained man would be on E-Wing for other reasons?
Detainees with visible mental health problems that were, difficult to manage. Detainees who were perhaps violent or refractory. Vulnerable detainees would be housed there. Those suspected of being under the age of 18 would be housed on E-Wing.
What about if you'd been on the CSU, the
Yes, sir. Yes.
solitary confinement? Would that be your next step before going back onto another wing?
Yes, you'd be kind of phased back into
Yeah.
association, so you'd be put on E-Wing where you could leave your cell, but where you couldn't leave the wing. Yes.
Yeah. So those were men who, for the reasons you give, would find themselves on E-Wing, but they wouldn't necessarily be under constant supervision in 7 or 8.
Correct, sir.
Right. Now, we discussed this a little yesterday at the end of E-Wing, large locked steel gate. And that went through to what? Remind us?
The solitary confinement block, or CSU as it was called sometimes.
Yeah. But affectionately known as the block.
The block.
Yeah. And describe the block or the CSU to us. If you go through the steel gate, what do you find?
And immediately finds another locked door. Then you have to unlock that and go through that door. Then you're met with a very short wing, sterile wing, smelt of urine and disinfectant. There was approximately 5 cells, single occupancy cells, and in here detainees would be kept in solitary confinement.
Yeah. And these were, by comparison to some of the cells you described earlier, where you had a TV and a kettle, were these devoid of those relative luxuries?
They were completely bare, sir.
Yeah.
Although they did have a bed, I should be clear about
Yeah, of
that.
course.
And bedding.
A bed and a toilet,
And toilet.
sink,
Yeah. Yes, sir.
but that was it.
Yes, sir.
And a single bed.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
On occasions, particularly if a detainee was being held in solitary confinement for a long time, they might be made allowances. Maybe they were allowed a book, or
Yeah.
if a detainee would be given a prayer mat, for example, if they requested it, or a Bible. That was usually afforded to a detainee in solitary confinement.
What do you mean by being held there for a long time?
Well, sometimes detainees were held there for days.
Yeah. Going back to the main part of E-Wing for a moment, did detained men have the same objects as you described for the other wings, TV, kettle, that sort of thing?
On the most part, yes.
Yeah.
Those in 7 or 8 usually would not be allowed a TV, not as a form of punishment, but because the bracket provided a ligature point.
Yeah. So that was the main part of E-Wing. The care and separation unit certainly not. And just help us, looking at your paragraph 139, why were detained men placed on the CSU? Why would they find themselves on the block, typically?
Refusal to be removed from the refusal to transfer, or to be deported, or to go down to E-Wing, or to sort of non-compliant behaviour, violent behaviour, fighting, protesting, be it on the netting or refusing to leave the courtyards at night. If a detainee set fire to something, sort of, if a detainee caused kind of real damage to anything, it's a form of, it was used as a form of punishment.
Ought it to have been?
No, and in fact, I understand that we were explicitly told in our training that it was not to be used as a form of punishment, but it was quite obvious that it was.
Yeah.
And as a way of managing detainees with mental health problems.
Yeah.
That wasn't the only method deployed, of course.
The B-Wing, which was above E-Wing, you've told us more than once, was supposed to be used as the induction wing. Was it, in your time there, always used as the induction wing? Did it have particular problems?
Yes, that's correct, sir. It wasn't always used as an induction wing. It's true that when detainees were admitted to the centre, they would most likely go on to B-Wing, almost always. But the problem with B-Wing is that it had a number of detainees on the wing that weren't new to the centre. A fair number, some of whom were involved in the drugs and gang culture at Brook House. And I have said in my statement that I felt this created a harmful impression of the kind of place Brook House was. Because although it was a minority of detainees on the wing that were involved in drugs and gangs, and this was communicated to me by one of the wing officers, Darren Tomset,
Darren Tom says.
Yes, whilst undercover at Brook House, he talked about the influence that, I think he said there were 8 members on the wing who were involved in the drugs and gang culture at Brook House. And he was talking about sort of learnt behaviour and the example it sets to new detainees when they entered the detention centre. And I agreed with him. I felt that it created a really harmful impression of the kind of place Brook House was.
And the impression you're talking about was the impression given to new people who came in through B Wing would be confronted by a number of detained men who were involved in drugs and gang culture.
Yes, yes, sir.
Was there a welfare office?
Yes, sir.
Where was that?
During the relevant period, it was near the visits corridor, sort of in that middle bulk of the H towards the perimeter road in the first building.
And what did the welfare office do?
They would try to help detainees fill out for example, they'd help them fill out forms if it was a bail application or an application for sort of temporary housing. If a detainee had poor English, they would maybe try and help them get in touch with a translator. I found the welfare officers to be helpful officers, kind and compassionate, willing to help, but there was only a couple of them, and of course there was only over 400 detainees in the centre, so the workload placed upon them was demanding, and I mean there was no way they could see to the needs of all the detainees, so they're in high demand.
And the welfare officers, was that a a job that people volunteered for, or were they assigned?
I'm not sure, sir. Sorry.
All right. All right, let's move on then, please, to something else I want to ask you about, starting on your page 37, about the daily regime and including meal times. Detained men, were they locked in their cells overnight?
Yes, sir.
From what time to what time?
Roughly 9 p.m. till 8 a.m.
And you mentioned it yesterday, but just remind us, there were 2 times during the day that they were locked in as well, 12 to 12:30 and 5 to 5:30. Was that for meal times?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And was there any exception, forget the meal times, was there any exception to anyone being locked in their cell overnight from 9 till 8?
No, sir. Unless someone had arrived at Brook House in the middle of the night and was being discharged from Brook House in the middle of the night.
Yeah. We've heard mention of roll counts. Tell us about those. What were they and how were they conducted?
So at 9 o'clock at night, when all the detainees were locked in their cells, every detainee in the detention centre would have to be accounted for to make sure no one had escaped. So staff would go about the wings counting up the detainees. So you'd have one DCO on the ground floor, one DCO on the second floor, one DCO on the third floor. They'd count all the detainees in their cells, add the number up. If the number matched the amount of detainees that were meant to be on the wing, then they could report this to the Oscar 1, which we spoke about earlier. If all the wings came back with the correct number, then the roll count would be called correct. All detainees would be accounted for. The announcement would be made over the radio and staff could go home. If this was called incorrect, there'd have to be a recount. This wasn't really a problem at night because detainees were going to be in their cells for the next 11 hours, so it doesn't really matter how long it was called incorrect for. But it became a problem when there would have to be a roll count again at 8 a.m. before detainees were unlocked from their cells, and 12 o'clock in the afternoon and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, evening, when there would also be a roll count. And so detainees would not be unlocked from their cells until roll count was called correct. So of course, if it was called correctly, detainees would be unlocked from their cells on time. This happened often, but what was an almost daily occurrence also was an incorrect roll count, and this would revolve this would involve a recount, and so detainees would be kept in their cells for longer than was necessary.
Yeah. Did staffing levels affect the roll count or affect the lockups?
Yes, sir.
In what way?
Well, you had the less staff you had, the less staff there were to count the detainees, which just made the process more difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, as simple as that, sir.
You talk about in your statements at paragraph 147 an incident that occurred in the evening of the 22nd of May when you were on D Wing to assist with lockup because they were short-staffed. Was there a consequence arising out of that?
Out of the short staffing?
Yeah, on that particular evening. You mentioned it in your statements at 147.
This is when detainees became upset, yes, and disruptive.
Tell us what happened that you remember.
Well, it was just more because you had to, often because, you know, at the end of the shift you'd have every detainee back on their wing. So unlike association periods when everyone's outside, most people are outside the wings in the library, gym or whatever, the wings are much easier to manage during association periods. It's much more difficult to manage during lock-up times because you've got over 100 people on the wing. And you've got to try and encourage all of those detainees to go back to their cells. So the more staff you would have, the more sort of manpower there was to say to the, usher detainees back to their room, say, come on, get a move on, get back to your cells. Dealing with short-staffed on this particular shift, there wasn't many staff to show detainees to their cells, and some detainees took the opportunity to be disruptive and voice their anger at having to go back to their rooms.
Yeah. I mean, should we imagine that when the lockups came around, that the men were compliant, or did you find yourself having to persuade them back into their rooms?
I mean, detainees did not want to be locked behind a cell door for the next 11 hours, so they were always reluctant to go back to their cells. Yeah. Some still went despite being reluctant. Others sort of tried to stay outside of their cells as much as they could. I mean, it was rarely kind of... It was just sort of... I mean, who wouldn't want to go... Who would want to go back to the cell? It was... It was just a bit of a game of cat and mouse, really, at lock-up time. Yeah. So the more people you had, the easier it was. Once you told someone, they'd usually go back. Yeah. Because they were aware of the consequences.
And the mealtime lock-ups, were they exacerbated by the fact that DCOs would take their breaks at those times?
No, in fairness, perhaps I should have made this clear in the statement. The DCOs on the wings wouldn't take their breaks until everyone was in their cells. Yeah. But because sort of the end of association periods was called around 5 to 15 minutes before the hour, you'd usually have sufficient amount of time to get detainees back into their cells so that you could go on a break at 12. But sometimes they would go later.
Now I'm looking at your paragraph 156. And you talk about when detainees were unlocked from their cells for lunch and dinner. As you've told us more than once, between 12:30 and 1 o'clock or thereabouts, you say more usually, and between 5:30 and 6. Would you be occasionally tasked with unlocking detained men from their cells?
Yes, sir.
What was the point in locking them away for a half an hour on each occasion, lunch and dinner? What was the point in it?
To count the detainees. I mean, I don't. So staff could take their breaks. I mean, there's no sort of strong reason for it in my eyes.
But I mean, you're locking them away to bring them out again to have their meals, aren't you? Mm-hmm. So could you understand any point, or did you ever question why we're doing this?
I mean, on reflection, I don't see the point, but at the time, it's the regime it's a prison-like regime which you become accustomed to, so you don't question it.
All right. Well, let's imagine that they're all out of their cells. Are they all out at the same time and all in at the same time?
They're all in at the same time, but they're unlocked slowly. So to manage the food queue,
Right. So you go along the cells, letting out a few at a time?
you'd usually let out a floor at a time.
Right.
Then when the food queue had kind of got down to a couple of people, you'd unlock the next floor.
So there's the one servery for the whole wing.
Mhm.
There isn't a different servery on each floor.
Correct, sir.
And the detained men would come out of their cells as they are unlocked and queue up at the servery to get their food.
Yes, sir.
And how many members of staff would there be checking who's eating and who isn't?
One, sir.
DCO or DCM?
Usually a DCO, sometimes a DCM, if
Yeah.
they were particularly short.
I mean, the instance we looked at before on the 31st of May, when you had that exchange with Nathan Ring, was that at a meal time or was that
Yes, sir.
afterwards?
Yes,
So-
it was sort of just after mealtime, yes.
Right, but which suggests that he was there at the time that food was being dished out, or just afterwards?
At the time, sir, yes.
Yeah.
So what would happen, sir, is I would have been stood at the front of the food queue, ticking off detainees who were eating. Because they'd come to the front of the servery queue, they'd give you their name and room number, you tick them off as having collected their food. I mean, they could have just thrown the food in the bin and not eaten it, but, there had to be some, way of recording it, and that was the way. So you would tick them off as having eaten. And once all the detainees had come to collect their food, or no more detainees were coming to collect their food, you'd then go and visit the cells of the detainees who hadn't come to collect their food. You'd ask them why they weren't eating, or you'd try and encourage them to eat. Sometimes they just weren't hungry and would eat later on. That was often the case.
When you say eat later on, what would they eat if the server is closed?
Well, so if it was 12 o'clock, then that was the lunchtime
Yeah.
lock up. But then at 5 o'clock, that was dinner time lock up.
Right.
So if they didn't come and collect their lunch, there was a good chance they'd come and collect their dinner later.
But they wouldn't have an opportunity or a second bite, as it were, of eating lunch if they missed out.
Correct, sir.
Okay. And did the same obtain at breakfast time as well? Or was it a different regime at
No, sir.
breakfast?
Detainees just came and went for their breakfast, as far as I'm aware.
All right.
Because I started to work at 8:15, breakfast was dished up just before this time.
Right.
I didn't oversee much of breakfast times.
But was there also a monitoring mechanism at breakfast time, as far as you know?
Not as far as I know. So actually, a detainee may have been refusing food at lunch and dinner, but have been eating lots at breakfast. But if this persisted for a good few days, staff would assume that the detainee had not eaten for a few days,
Yeah.
when he may have done.
I see. And what was the nature of the form that was used to tick food refusal or fluid refusal?
It was a table with 3 columns, and the first column had the detainee's name and room number. In the second column, in the third column, it was just empty. So if the detainee came to eat, you'd tick the empty box. If you didn't, you'd leave it blank.
Right. So anybody looking over the form would look at the empty boxes and realise that that person hadn't eaten.
Yes, sir.
That's assuming the form was correctly completed.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Altman, can I ask a brief question?
Of course.
Mr. Tully, talking about the process of locking detainees behind their doors for roll counts, am I right in thinking that for detainees who had formerly spent time in the prison estate, that would be routine to them and they would understand the reason why that was happening, even if they weren't particularly happy about
Chair.
that? For those who hadn't been in the prison estate and so this was a completely different experience and unknown to them, did people have questions about why that was happening?
Questions were rare because there seemed to be a fear from those detainees most often to challenge staff, but it was clearly distressing for detainees who had not been in a custodial setting when being sent to their cells and locked behind their doors.
Yeah. When it was explained to you during your training, the purpose for conducting a roll count in that way, can you remember how that was explained to you? What the rationale was for people going back into their cells and being locked away?
To the best of my recollection, it was simply to ensure that all the detainees were accounted for and that there were no escapees.
So that you could count people without people moving around and the risk of missing somebody or double counting.
Yes,
Is that
Chair.
your understanding?
Yes, Chair, that's
Okay.
correct. Yes, yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, let's move on from there, please. And I want to look at the conduct and attitudes of other members of staff, which you deal with from paragraph 164 onwards. And you were asked to set out your general knowledge and views about the behaviour and attitude of other staff, their character, personality and values, and the culture, attitudes and behaviour of staff towards detained men, other colleagues and oversight bodies. Now, you've given us some of this information along the way. And the way that you preferred to do it in your witness statement was to deal with it by way of reference to some of the incidents to which we'll come. But I just want to get a sort of general picture from you, perhaps a little more than you've already given us. First of all, by looking at your paragraph 165. What did you think of the majority of officers, DCOs in particular, who worked at Brook House?
That they were good people, sir.
And was that equally true of the DCMs?
Some of them, sir.
You name what you call one of the most inspiring members of staff you came across there. Who was that?
DCM called Stuart Povey, sir. Stuart Povey Meyer, I think.
And what was it about him that stood out?
He cared. He cared about... He tried his best in the environment that he was in. He tried to see to the needs of detainees. He showed compassion. He showed respect. Treated them as human beings. I know that sounds like kind of basic stuff that you'd expect from a DCM, but sadly it was not. It was not so commonplace amongst DCMs. But I felt he made extra effort to see to the needs of detainees, and he led by example. I think he showed real leadership, and it was brave for him as a DCM to be as compassionate and caring as he was when so many of those at his level were abusive. And I don't know if he was particularly popular with the abusive DCMs. I very rarely saw him interacting with them, but he just kept himself to himself, went about his business and tried to do his best in the environment that he found himself in.
As I say, we're going to come back to individual incidents, not now, although you deal with them. Deal with one in particular at this stage of your statement, but we're going to deal with them towards the end of this general evidence from you. You've already told us about the difficulty in raising complaints, the culture of silence, what you felt was a lack of oversight from, in particular, you say in this part of your statement, Ben Saunders and the SMT.
Yes, sir.
Is that what you felt, there was a lack of oversight from up high?
Absolutely, sir. Barely visible.
And you also say, in addition to the culture of silence, and I'm just summarising really what you say in these paragraphs, the fact that officers could brag and joke about the abuse that was conducted showed that there was faith in the culture of silence. In other words, we can say what we want about what we've done, knowing full well that nobody will ever tell on us.
Precisely, sir. They had absolute confidence that nothing they said, anything they said, would come back to haunt them.
You mentioned earlier about somebody you met early on who herself was the subject of bullying and complained to the SMT. Do you know who she complained to?
No, sir.
As far as you're concerned, this is a question G4S have asked me to ask you, and the Chair agrees that it should be asked, is did you ever speak to any other officers about making complaints? In other words, do you remember I characterised it as people in your camp earlier? Stuart Povey Meyer, for example, was, as you would have it, one of the good guys. Did you never speak to him? You said one of your problems was you couldn't speak to managers because they were in it. They were engaged in the abuse. But if he wasn't one of them, why wasn't he somebody you could speak to?
Again, it comes back to the question of evidence and proof. Even if he was someone who I could speak to, which perhaps he was, although he was a DCM, and so I still didn't have confidence that my complaints to him would have been treated anonymously.
Yeah.
I would have had no evidence of the abuse that I bore witness to, given that much of the abuse I witnessed was in the cells in which there were no cameras. So it was always came back to this question of who are they going to believe? The SMT going to believe their chums at DCM level, or are they going to believe me?
Did you ever discover, apart from that one person you've mentioned already, the woman, did you ever discover whether any other officer at any level ever complained about what they had witnessed?
I was never aware of any complaints being made by any staff members about the treatment of detainees by staff.
Yeah.
Obviously, much later I learned about Nathan Ward and the complaints that he made to the G4S hierarchy.
Yeah.
And he was a much more senior member of staff than I was, and he wasn't listened to. So, in hindsight, I have every confidence that I made the right call, and that I mean, if he wasn't listened to, then what chance did I have as an activities officer?
Yeah.
18, 19, 20 years old, being listened to or believed? Very much doubt I would have been.
But one of the other things we've heard from you more than once now about the Speak Out poster and the what was scrawled across it in the toilets opposite the detainee shop.
So,
But I just want to ask you about a couple of other examples, please. Can we put up on screen TRN 000076? So that's 5 zeros and 76. Chair, for you, it's B100. And it's a transcript from a clip for the 4th of May of 2017. And if we go to page 2, please. We see from the top, and perhaps we can zoom in at the top half to begin with, and then we can work our way down. You talk about somebody called Babs having been suspended. Do you remember now who Babs was?
yes, sir.
Who was Babs?
I don't know his real name, but he was, I think he was a D-wing officer, sir.
A what officer?
A Delta wing officer.
Right.
Duff,
And somebody
sorry.
called Ginge says, yeah, do you know who Ginge is?
I don't know his real name, sir.
Instone Brewer?
Yes,
Surname hyphenated?
that rings a bell, sir.
And let's just look at how the conversation shapes up. Yeah, I'm told that Babs is, thank you, Mr. Livingston, Babatunde Fagbo. Does that mean anything to you?
Babatunde rings a bell, sir, yes.
Yeah, staff member.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. And the conversation goes this way. Why is Babs being suspended? No different to what did he do? No different to what most officers do. He was getting like a load of racial abuse from a detainee. Babs, being Babs, told him to go and fuck himself, yeah. And someone's reported it. And you ask what? An officer. And he says, officer maybe, I don't know. And you say, or a detainee. And Ginge says, I can't confirm. Ginge, but it sounds like that's the way it's gone. And you forgive me, say, and how did, and it sounded like Shane, maybe not, and his son get pulled into it? Does that mean anything to you?
I imagine Shane is I'm referencing an officer. I'm not sure about his son.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah, I don't know, sir.
Same thing. What they were giving him stick as well. Yeah, same thing, same incident. And then a little further down, about a third of the way up, you say, I bet Babs is fuming. You see that?
Yes, sir.
And this conversation continues that way. And then on the next page, page 3, about at line 56, Ginge says, be careful what you say, mate. And you say, eh? And he says, gotta watch what you say. And you say, watch what you say, yeah? And somebody else called Joe Marshall says, yeah, so true, that in the current climate. And then you say, do you reckon it was? And you don't complete your sentence. Ginge says, oh, no doubt. And you say, who do you reckon it was? Staff, do you reckon, or staff, sorry, staff, do you reckon staff dobbed him in? And then this person, Marshall, says, dobbed who in? What are you talking about, Babs? And the conversation continues. And then to the final page of this transcript, please. Page 4. No, it's my fault. Page 4, not 46. Thank you. Well, no, he hasn't been sent anything. Just say Ginge. I don't honestly... I honestly don't. If I did, I'd tell you who the fucking man is, all I know. And then Marshall says, someone's just been radioed. And then Ginge says, no one likes a snitch. So, although it's difficult to pick up all of the conversation that was going on and understand exactly what was being said, was the thrust of it that Babs had been suspended and somebody had given him up.
My inference is that perhaps a colleague snitched on Babs.
Yeah. Which ends with Ginge saying no one likes a snitch. It's
So,
the same kind of idea that you've spoken about many times now in the course of your evidence. Another example, please, if we can take that down, is transcript TRN 000079, chair B103. And this is a short transcript from the 31st of May. And if we can go to page 20, please. And if we can zoom in on that, please. And this is you talking to Dan Lake. Who was Dan Lake?
he was another activities DCO, sir.
The guy was absolutely creasing. I was speaking to him. You ask, what did he say? He said, yeah, they do. You ask, what did they say? He said, Lake, they just said, if you see anything, report it. And I'm pausing there. What was he talking about? Any idea?
I'm not sure, sir. And, do we know? I should probably know the answer to this, but I don't. But when he's saying they, I'm not sure who he's talking about.
And you say, no way, gets on my tits when something's missed, things like that. And he says this. He says to me, I'm not a snitch. He said, I'm not a grass. I'd never grass. He said, the only time I would tell is if it would get me sacked as well. And you say, yeah, everyone would do that. To which Lake says, which is fair, everyone would do that. He said, I'm not a grass at all. He said, he is all right, to be fair. He's a good lad. And you say he can't, and then something's missed, grassing people. ring any bells?
It doesn't, sir. I can go away and rewatch this. I'm afraid it doesn't ring any bells, sir.
All right. Well, again, though, whatever the actual topic or subject matter was, it's that kind of theme again, isn't it? It's about not grassing up another member of staff.
Yes, sir. I
And
think the
then
conversation here is about the only circumstances in which Lake would grass would be if not doing so would cause him to be sacked. That's the only thing I
Yeah.
can definitely take away from this. But what exactly we're talking about in the context, I'm not quite sure.
And who he's talking about.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. All right. And then lastly, perhaps just one other example. If we can go to another transcript, Chair B 105, TRN 000091 at page 11. June 10th, page 11, if we can zoom in, please. Is it Gary Croucher or Groucher?
I think it was Groucher, actually, sir.
And who is he?
He's an E-wing officer, sir.
DCO or DCM?
DCO, sir.
And you're having a conversation with him, talking about constant watches and stuff, officers asleep. Was there a problem with sometimes officers sleeping during constant supervision?
Very rarely, but it did happen.
Yeah. And he laughs, and you say, do you reckon people do snooze on constant watches at night? He says, yeah, sometimes something's missed, the manager's in the morning, something's missed, woke an officer up last night. And you say, what, the detainee? Something's missed. What, the detainee tells the manager? And he says, tells the manager, yeah, something's missed, grasses, plus they hear things, what you're saying, and grass you up. And you say, what are they like? Now, this might not be an example of a staff member complaining
Precisely,
or passing
sir.
on, but the detainee.
Indeed.
Which do you think it is in this case?
This is about a detainee grassing.
So did that happen as well from time to time?
Yeah, there was equal hostility towards detainees grassing you up than there was staff.
Yeah. Are these examples representative? I mean, there are only, in fact, 2 examples about no one likes a grass, no one likes a snitch. Those posters and your own general recollection of what would happen if somebody in your position did complain and it came to others' ears. Are these just 2 examples which you captured on during your filming representative, or are they just, singular examples of people expressing to you that nobody liked people grassing?
This is a small insight into the broader culture, which was one of complete hostility towards raising concerns.
One of the things you mentioned earlier to us was that the issues of abuse and misconduct weren't cured by turnovers of staff.
Sorry, sir, could you repeat that?
That the culture of abuse and misconduct wasn't cured by the turnover of staff. In other words, people came and people went,
Yes, sir.
but the new people would just, or some at least, would slot in where the others had left off.
Precisely, sir.
How do you account for that? I mean, what was it about what went on at Brook House that meant that, new green people who came in, freshskins, came in and in some cases behaved exactly the same? How do you account for that?
It's hard to know. I mean, it's hard to know if it. You don't want to make excuses for staff members who engage in abusive treatment of detainees, but I think because there is no excuse. I mean, there were so many staff members that were able to remain professional in the environment that they found themselves in. But I think not to acknowledge the part that the environment plays in, and the culture and the atmosphere plays in at least allowing people to abuse others with impunity is dangerous. As I said, it's not down to a few bad apples. There are cultural and systemic problems which give rise to the abuse. I mean, I'm not an expert, so I don't understand exactly why that is. Perhaps it's partly down to who G4S would recruit into these positions. Yeah, it's something I struggled to come to terms with, is why staff did behave the way they did. So trying to explain why people became abusive is difficult, because I can't relate to their thought process.
No. All right. Well, thank you. I mean, we're going to have some expert evidence from Professor Bosworth in the second phase of this inquiry, so maybe she'll be able to explain to us why this happened.
Sir.
All right, Mr. Tully, I see, Chair, at the time it's a few minutes after 4. Can I tell you where I am? So, Mr. Tully, you understand where I am and everybody else does. I've made reasonable progress, I think, through the generality of your evidence. I've got a few more topics to cover tomorrow morning, and then we will hopefully come on at some stage to looking at the incidents. All right, so that gives you an idea of where we are.
Thank you, sir.
So perhaps, Chair, if you agree, 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.